If you look at various nations around the world, one that readily comes to mind, and I can't remember the actual nation, but it's in the Far East. And it's something that's come up several times on the likes of Facebook, showing this beautiful landscape garden. And it's all been landscaped on top of a landfill site and turned into something very beautiful. Further to that, the use of plastics in tarmac in India and the roads not cracking and not having to be repaired. And what you'll actually see, you'll get these brilliant ideas that prove themselves in this or that country, and then it's like, well, if it's that good, why aren't all the other nations around the world adopting the same thing when it's proven that it's successful and it's something that works? It's always problem, reaction, solution. The big one, of course, would be something like plastic bottles, milk cartons in particular. Sort of use once, throw away, rather than the old glass milk bottles, which were sent back to the dairy, sterilised, cleaned out, refilled, reused over and over again. And obviously some of them would break. But generally you'd get more than one use out of those bottles. But of course things go backwards. It's like Concorde has gone, but where is the progression to something that replaces that? So you could go London to New York in 4 hours. So you're now back to sort of like, I don't know, what is it, 9-10 hour flight. So it's sort of, well, why has this been tested out here and has proved successful and not being adopted? But there's also a darker side to this. Now, if you watch Static in the Attic, what he's showing, and he's quite correct in what he is showing with the evidence that he is showing, that the Austrian painter of the mid-20th century, when he became a sort of very famous name around the world, shall we say, he would seem to be a good guy. Rather than dropping things of destruction, dropping leaflets across England saying we'd like peace because the problem's actually in the east, which wasn't taken up, obviously. But let's consider other things. Let's dig a little deeper with that story. It's always check sources for a start. It's always recognizing patterns. So when you recognize that there is something that seems to play two sides, so no matter what the outcome, and whichever one it tips the balance towards, it's always going to make a huge profit. There will be certain things that if you create a worldwide story, shall we say, something that involves many, many nations, it would make the perfect cover to actually carry out certain things that the rest of the world would say that is totally unacceptable. Experiments on human beings, on twins and things comes to mind. You could also use a particular nation as a test nation. And certainly this happened under the sort of era of the Austrian painter. Television and radio. Giving this technology to a wide base of a wide sort of part of the population, giving them access to all this new visual and audible information. Something that was never really to that scale. Television was sort of, what was it, 1923? So we're talking sort of 10 years after that and beyond for the next sort of 11, 12 years. And to unroll that as an experiment, you could then observe on how that nation would either react, respond, would they go with the narrative that is being presented to them, for example. So you could actually roll out two things to see how they progress under the cover of something else where everybody's attention is upon. You've also got to consider where the funding came from this. The Wall Street crash is very central to that as well. So it's a perfect example of how, when you're given the official narrative, it reads one way, but then with a bit of digging, you start to see a completely different picture. And there is a lot of truth in that. But when you dig a little bit deeper than that and consider the patterns and blueprints and keep in mind that there is something that is controlling more than one side, and it's playing what seems to be opposing sides, it can then carry out its other agendas, shall we say, because the attention is not going to be focused on that. This, I feel, is a valuable lesson on so much more. Because some things can appear one way, and then with a new set of information, it can then appear its complete opposite. But if you think of the story, it has a plot, and the plot always has a twist. May even have more than one twist. It may be, the analogy I've used is the champagne cork. It's one piece of wire, but you may only see the one end of the wire, the one polarity of it, and see the other end as something totally different, not realizing that it is the same piece of wire that has been twisted. Something else that comes out of recent events, and it goes back to something Rudolf Steiner spoke about in 1917, that there would be something in the medical world that would be developed to sever the spirit or God connection. So this begs the question, if you think of it in terms of spiritual, that saying about letting go, let go of what no longer serves you. So surely if the connection, we'll call it God, if the connection to God has been severed, surely those that have been coerced now no longer serve that God. So what would that God do? Surely it would follow the same pattern. It would let go of what no longer serves. Just a thought. So a few things to think about on this. I'm not saying it definitely is, but what I'm saying is don't just stop on, if you find an alternative to something, that may also not be the whole truth either. There is such a thing as controlled opposition, of course, which there will always be things that maybe even 90% right, but that last 10% is not. But to me, this seems, what I've pointed to and checking the sources, would seem that the Austrian painter is not a good guy at all. and was doing exactly what he was put in that role to do, with the outcome as it was, which then led on to, well, one minute they're allies, now they're opposites, East versus West and the Cold War and all that, which is rather bizarre anyway. But why is it always centered on Europe? Why was it's like 50, 60 miles that separates Alaska, which is part of the United States, from what was the Soviet Union? Were there any things lined up and pointing against each other on those two coastlines? Or was it all in the European theatre? A few things to ponder there. So I'm going to say unconditional love to you all.